The scripture today comes from the book of First Kings, starting in chapter 5, 1 through 5, and then to chapter 8, 1 through 13. When Hiram, king of Tyre, heard that Solomon had been anointed king to succeed his father David, he sent his envoys to Solomon, because he had always been on friendly terms with David. Solomon sent back this message to Hiram. You know that because of the wars waged against my father David from all sides, he could not build a temple for the name of the Lord, his God, until the Lord put his enemies under his feet. But now the Lord my God has given me rest on every side, and there is no adversary or disaster. I intend, therefore, to build a temple for the name of the Lord my God. And the Lord told my father David, when he said, Your son, whom I will put on the throne in your place, will build the temple for my name. Then King Solomon summoned into his presence at Jerusalem the elders of Israel, all the heads of the tribes and the chiefs of the Israelite people, to bring up the ark of the Lord's covenant from Zion to the city of David. All the Israelites came together to King Solomon at the time of the festival in the month of Ethnium, the 7th month. When all the elders of Israel had arrived, the priests took up the ark, and they brought up the ark of the Lord to the tent of meeting, and all the sacred furnishings in it. The priests and Levites carried them up, and King Solomon and the entire assembly of Israel that had gathered about him were before the ark, sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they could not be recorded or counted. The priests then brought the ark of the Lord's covenant to the place in the inner sanctuary of the temple, the most holy place, and put it beneath the wings of the cherubim. The cherubim spread their wings over the place of the ark and overshadowed the ark and its carrying poles. These poles were so long that their ends could be seen from the holy place in the front of the inner sanctuary, but not from the outside of the holy place. And they were still there today. There was nothing in the ark except the 2 stone tablets that Moses had placed in it at Horeb, where the Lord made a covenant with the Israelites after they came out of Egypt. When the priests withdrew from the holy place, the cloud filled the temple of the Lord. And the priests could not perform their service because of the cloud, for the glory of the Lord filled his temple. Then Solomon said, The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever. This week, I want to talk about a church word. I want to introduce a church word, and I hope that maybe it's a word that I can use in the future. If not, I'll probably still give the definition every time. But I want to talk a little bit this week about ecclesiology. It kind of sounds like that book, Ecclesiastes. They have some similar ideas. Ecclesiology is the study of the church. Like ecclesial means churchy, ecclesiology. And it asks some of the questions of what is the church for? What does it do? Why does it have to exist? Does it need to exist? How should we structure the church? What kinds of things need to happen for church to be church? What's the church's role in the work that God is doing in this world? A lot of these questions, it's centered around, I'm hesitating to say the words institution of the church, but what does the institution of the church do? That's what ecclesiology is asking. A few weeks ago, we asked a little bit of an ecclesiological term when we looked at the call of Samuel, and I asked you to reflect on what actions of church have to make it church for you. Is it singing hymns? Is it hearing scripture? Is it praying? Is it prayerless? What is it that happens during church that makes it church for you? But this week, I'm going to complicate that question just a little bit and ask, what is church for? Not what happens during church and makes it church, but what do those things do? So let me give an example. When we talked about it last time, a lot of people said that music was a really important part of their church experience. If we didn't sing, it wouldn't be church. But why? What's it for? What part does singing play in the work that the church is doing, and then in the work that God is doing in this world? Maybe it's something that's deeply meaningful to you and helps you connect with the presence of God. Maybe there's something about the singing of voices together, the community aspect of singing, that really just brings your heart into a certain place. Maybe it's the lyrics or the words that are written that teach you theology or help you reflect on some truth about God. Maybe there's just songs that are just deeply important to you. A lot of people, the song Amazing Grace just touches their heart in a very special way because of its connection to maybe the funeral of a loved one. But what are they for? It's one of the reasons that it's one of the reasons there's so much difference between contemporary worship and traditional worship, specifically the music. Many traditional hymns are for teaching theology. They have simple tunes that repeat over and over and over and over, and for 15, 12 verses. We all know those hymns. And they're very deep in theology. If you read through some of the verses, you can just learn so much about what the writer of that hymn believed to be true about God. While many of the contemporary songs that we sing, they're written in a way that elicits an emotional response. We have those power verses, or we have that classic 90s half step up where we're singing and then we're singing even higher and we're singing even more powerfully because we're more connected to God, because we're halfway done through the song. But often those songs lack the deep theological reflection that we see in a lot of hymns. Those two kinds of music are for different things in the church. They do different purposes. And so this is where we start getting these questions of ecclesiology. Should you have one or the other? Is it important to have both? How do we navigate some of these questions about what we're supposed to do at church? And so here today in the passage, we have the building of the first permanent temple. Remember, till now it's been a tent that you can set up and take down, set up and take down. And in fact, Israel has spent the last several of its years in war in the city of Jerusalem. But before that, they were wandering the desert, setting up and tearing down, and doing that all over the desert, following the cloud in the presence of God. And so now we're building this permanent place, this place with a foundation that you can't move. And it has to lead us to asking the question, what is this space for? What's it for? In the desert, the tabernacle was for showing Israel where to follow God to and from. But now it's not moving anymore. It doesn't serve that same purpose. Or does it? As we go in today's scripture, we're getting into the book of Kings. I say the book of Kings instead of the books of Kings because originally, 1st and 2nd Kings were just smashed together. In fact, the split that we have in our modern Bibles is just kind of arbitrary and actually splits a single narrative in half, which is a kind of silly place to split it in half. I think somebody was maybe copying it down to a notebook and then just ran out of pages, so went to the next one. Seriously though, when we read it as one giant long book versus two separate books, maybe that gives us a little bit of a different perspective of not being two separate stories, but one long testament to what's happening in the world of Israel. It's important that when we look at these books that we recognize that they are historical documents. They are telling us things that happened in the life of Israel. But it's also important that we recognize these are not modern history books. When we have history in the modern world, what we want is essentially video camera footage. We want exact details, completely and totally, nothing left out, straight through. And we want the whole story, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. That's what we want. But that's not what these documents are. The records of history that are being presented to us are telling us a narrative story. They're trying to teach us about God and humans interacting with one another, Israel following God and God continuing to call Israel. They are primarily theological documents that are shaping our understanding about who God is and who we are to God through the stories of Israel. And so that means we might not have perfect video cam footage. In fact, we're going to see places where Kings and Chronicles and Samuel start to fight with one another and they have arguments. In fact, in our passage today, it tells us specifically the only thing in the Ark of the Covenant are the 2 tablets. But didn't we read in the book of Exodus that they also collected and put in a jar of manna? Where did that go? Hebrews in the New Testament is going to tell us that they put Aaron's staff in there after he passed away. Where did that go? These aren't historical documents in that they tell us exactly what happened, but they're historical documents in that they tell us about God through what happened. They're shaping an understanding of who we are and who God is. And the book of Kings is primarily interested in asking the question of what is our role and what is God's role in the unfolding story of Israel. What role do each of us play? And so in today's text, we're going to start digging into that question. But specifically, we're diving into this story, this account of Solomon having taken over. He's been anointed as king after his father David has died. And he's remembering this story that we can read in the book of Samuel. David, who has just built his throne, he's just built his house of cedar, he says, and he resolves himself. He says, you know what? I've got a pretty house. God needs a pretty house. I'm going to build it. And God essentially tells him, no, I don't want one. Not right now, at least. But one day, your son will build me a temple. Well, will build me a dwelling place. Note that there is some Hebrew silliness happening here that we have to understand. When we look at this story in 2020 vision and we hear Solomon say, I am that son, I am the son who is going to build a temple for God, we know in hindsight that Solomon is not successful in building a dwelling place for God that will last for eternity. He is not the son that will become the everlasting king. We know that because we are on the other side of this story. What's happening in the Hebrew is that the word son, bane, doesn't only mean son. It also means grandson, great-grandson, great-great-grandson, great-great-great-great-grandson, and descendants in total. All of your descendants are your sons and daughters. I am a son of Adam, even though it doesn't track. You know, I can't pull up my family tree and show you exactly how that connection works because I'm a descendant. I am a son of. And so in 2020 vision, we know that Solomon isn't the son who's going to make the temple, but he's going to barrel ahead anyway. And so he gets with the king of Tyre and he starts the process of building the temple. And he builds it through some questionable means. He starts wheeling and dealing with the other nations around him, starting with the king of Tyre. He's going to get the cedars from Lebanon. He's going to have their expert woodsmen cut down the trees. He's going to have them ship them in. He's going to have all kinds of resources brought in from all around the Middle East to make this temple. And he's going to start making some pretty big promises to continue to supply for and to give out the resources of Israel. In fact, he says, King of Tyre, you hire your men and I will pay you anything that you ask. He's going to start writing some very big checks that Israel isn't going to be able to cash in the long term. And then he starts to indenture his own people. He starts putting them on a 3-month rotation where he just plucks people out of their lives and says, you now are working on the temple. And whether they like that or not, because they're participating in building God's temple, he's still indenturing his people and making them into temporary slaves. This is an issue from a people who were slaves. In short, he stomps over anyone and everyone to accomplish this work of building a temple. And the whole time, the book of Kings is dropping us breadcrumbs to show us that Solomon is heading down a terrible road. From 1 Kings chapter 10, I want you to compare this passage, just this small little passage, 1 Kings 10:28, with some of the law that we've gotten in Deuteronomy. 1 Kings 10:28 tells us that Solomon's horses were imported from Egypt. He had the finest Egyptian horses brought in so that they could be part of his fleet of horses. But when we look back at Deuteronomy, the writer of Kings is going to show us something interesting. We read there, the king, moreover, must not acquire a great number of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more for them. For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. This isn't the only one. Again and again and again, the book of Kings is going to tell us that Solomon is barreling ahead, amassing wealth and a future for Israel that is contrary to the plan that God is establishing. And so we get to this final section, this chapter 8. Solomon finishes the temple and he lets it sit empty for a few months. He just lets it sit there because he's waiting for the right time to dedicate it. And so several months later, sometime in September or October, he brings all of the people together for the Festival of Tabernacles. It's a pilgrimage festival that we read about in the law. And it's a time where Israel comes together and remembers that they were once wanderers of the desert. It's also called the Festival of Sukkot, the Festival of Tents. And they come together and they live in these tents. There's a whole process for doing it. And they celebrate in Jerusalem. And so right after that, Solomon has the dedication of the temple when everyone is already there to renew the covenant with God. And so at this moment, he has the Ark of the Covenant brought in. And it's almost reminiscent of David's bringing in of the Ark when they walked 6 steps and make a sacrifice. Walk 6 steps and make a sacrifice. We're told that Solomon and the people and the priests are sacrificing so many sheep and cattle that they're unable to be counted or recorded. They are just going above and beyond. There's so much pomp and circumstance that goes into the dedication of this temple. And they bring in the ark on these poles that are just ridiculously long for its purpose, showing that God's presence is able to move hither and thither. And as the presence of the Lord descends, we can almost imagine this vortex of cloud coming down into the temple, and people are scattering. And we're told that the priests can't perform their service because the temple has been filled with the presence of the Lord. Solomon stands back, and I can almost imagine his arms folded and the smug look on his face as he says, "The Lord has said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you and a place for you to dwell forever." I don't think Solomon is necessarily being prideful. I think when he says, "I have built a temple," I think he means I, as in I, the king of Israel, as the leader of, and the people of Israel have built this magnificent temple. Maybe I'm reading him wrong, but he's a wise man. He knows that he didn't pick up a hammer and cut every stone. But I do have some questions for him about this statement. And I have a little bit of a Hebrew funny that I think is kind of fun. When he says he's built a magnificent temple, the word that we translate as magnificent in the NIV has a second meaning of elevated, lifted high, lofty. And I think that that's really funny. And I just think it's a nice little trivia piece because the temple's on the top of a mountain. It literally is. a lofty temple, a lofty house. I think that that's a funny little trivia. But he says, I've built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever. And I want to ask Solomon, what exactly makes the temple magnificent? Is it the building itself? Is it the decor that you've chosen? Is it the design that's been laid out? Is it those cherubim? Is it the nice curtains? Is it the building that's magnificent? Or is it the presence of God that makes it magnificent? Solomon walked all over others to accomplish this goal he had set himself on. He compromised his honor as king, he abused his peoples, and he put at risk the sovereignty of his entire nation. And that's just to build a giant building where God can live forever. A side note, I say a giant building, but Solomon's temple is bigger than the house that he built for God. That might be a little telling for us. And it makes me wonder what Solomon thinks that the temple is for. What is Solomon's ecclesiology saying about this space that he's built? Is it a place where God lives and we can just go and visit him anytime that we want? Like, is it just a place for him to be? Is it a guarantee that God's presence will be in Israel forever? And no matter what they do, God is now stuck there because that's where he dwells forever. Is the temple a place that we go to or a place that we're sent from? What is the value, I wonder, in Solomon's mind of having a place where God lives? I want to suggest that the American church has historically fallen into the trap of seeing this verse as proclaiming that God's place and only residence is the church. Specifically, is the building that we call churches. And I think that we probably would go, oh, no, that's not what I believe. The church isn't a building, it's the people. And while I think that we say that, certainly, I think that that's been undercut in the last few years by the number of churches who insisted that in the midst of a global pandemic where churches were a space where people were actively dying, where every worship service had the potential to become a super spreader event, a place where churches are banning people from wearing masks inside. I wonder if in the midst of all that, in the midst of a global pandemic, when we've argued that worshiping God can only take place in a church building, do we really believe the church is the people? Or do we, like I think we can see Solomon, see the building as being the place where God lives? We must not allow ourselves to fall into that mindset. That we have to be willing, we don't want to be willing to compromise and hurt others so that we can have a magnificent building. We can't put people at risk. We can't compromise ourselves or the sovereignty of God's rule in the search of having these magnificent spaces. Because the book of Kings tells us a very nuanced truth. And it's very subtle, and there are specific words and ideas strung throughout Kings that point us this way. The temple is the place where the glory of God lives, not God. We're not Jewish, so this is maybe a little hard to wrap our heads around. It would be like if we as Christians said, the Spirit lives in the church, not God. Or the Father lives in the church, not God. It's a little confusing, I think. This point could be a whole sermon all on its own, the difference between the glory of God and God. But to put it more simply, the temple is not an earthly dwelling place for God, but it is a tangible establishment of God's sovereignty and presence. Okay, maybe that wasn't that much more simple. How about an analogy? Let's go with an analogy. Maybe that will help us. If you go into any government building, whether it be the Bureau of Motor Vehicles, whether it be a courthouse, wherever you go, if it's a state or federal building, it's going to have the picture of the president somewhere. It just is. That's a thing. But it's not actually the president taking up office there. You can't go visit the president at the local BMV. He's not there. But there is a tangible representation of their leadership and their authority in that place. And because it's everywhere, it also is symbolic of the president's authority everywhere in this country. The analogy falls apart at a certain point because God is both here and both not here. But it's focusing on this idea that it's a tangible representation of God's presence. Similarly, the church is that tangible representation of God's presence and sovereignty in the world. It's a place where we go from to share and proclaim that good news. Even with all of our pomp and our circumstance, even through all of our meddling and wheeling and dealing, God does what God does. The purpose of the church is to show that God is doing, not be the place where God does. It is a place where God does, but it's because God does everywhere, right? This week, I want to invite you to do some more reflection. I asked you during the Samuel sermon to reflect on what part of church has to be part of church. And I want to invite you to reflect a little bit further, a little bit deeper into your ecclesiology. And I want to ask you, those things that you have said have to exist. What do they do in the life of a Christian? What is the purpose of missions, or singing hymns, or praying for one another, or gathering for worship, or taking communion? If those are important parts of church, what do they do in the church? And how do they show and reveal God's sovereignty and authority in this world? Today is Reformation Sunday. Reformation Sunday, it's the reason it's one of the holidays that we celebrate. It's October 31st each year. And Reformation Sunday is the day when we remember Martin Luther's nailing of the 95 Theses to his local Catholic church. If you're not familiar with this history, that's okay. I'm going to get somewhere with it. The 95 Theses presented a criticism of the Catholic Church by Martin Luther, who was a Catholic priest, and eventually led to him going on trial and almost facing execution. It's the movement that led into the Protestant Reformation that eventually created the Lutheran Church and other expressions of Christianity. Only a church leadership that understands its role, a church that understands the role of the church and the purpose of the church, could possibly go through that kind of criticism, that kind of work, and come out the other side and glorify God. 221 years later, after the Reformation took place, an Anglican priest was reading one of Martin Luther's commentaries on the book of Romans. And during that time, he came to be assured of salvation through Christ. And then he founded a movement which offered criticisms, again, on how the church was going about doing its work in God's kingdom. That priest, that Anglican priest, John Wesley, founded a movement which lit a fire of spiritual revival, which eventually led to a group of believers to establish this church in which we worship today. From that very first day, that one man who was willing to question and ask, what is the church for? What is the church doing? Led to this service today. When we ask the hard questions, we create movements of God's presence which extend beyond anything we could possibly hope to accomplish in our lives. In short, we can do better than Solomon. We don't have a God who can be put in a cage and held in one place in perpetuity. We don't create one house for God to live in forever. Instead, we remember that, of course, he isn't safe, but he is king. And we participate in the work that God is doing. And we create a space for him to dwell forever in all of creation, not just the church. May be true in your life and in mine.